Fonts, there's an awful lot of them out there, isn't there? There are so many to choose from, and when it comes to choosing just a few for your branding, it can seem overwhelming. There's just so many to pick from, and just when you think you may have found the right ones, then you come across something else that just seems so gorgeous that you just really want to use. So how do you choose the right fonts for your brand? Now, changing up your fonts all the time is not a great move when it comes to branding. You want to start to get really consistent. You may over time find that a certain font isn't working and you want to make changes or just slight shifts where you just find something that's quite similar but just needs to change just a little bit. You don't want to be changing every week or every month. You really want to be trying to stay long-term consistent with the fonts that you choose. And you don't want to be just suddenly randomly using some font because it's pretty, but you want to be constantly using the exact same fonts all the time. It's so easy to fall into font temptation, especially if you're a font lover. So let's talk a little bit how you start to work out the fonts that are going to be right for your brand. So first of all, let's look at all the different types of fonts there are. Because once you understand that, then you can start to look at what kinds you want to be using and then try and find the right font for you. First of all, we've got serif fonts. So these are the fonts with little bits on the end. These are called serif. So these fonts have a more formal and traditional feel to them. Then there's the sans serif fonts. Now these fonts basically have the serif chopped off, so they don't have those little funny things on the end, they're just flat or round on the end. And these fonts feel a little bit more modern and clean. Now the serif font we looked at just a second ago, that's really good when you're using a lot of copy, so a lot of text. You notice that books will usually be using serif fonts because when it comes to a lot of text, these are easy to read. Now a sans serif font can still work well for reading, but you don't want crazy amounts of text. A sans serif font also works well for text, but as long as it's not too crazy lengthy. I often find when it comes to font pairing in your brand, it's often helpful to have both a serif and a sans serif font, because this means depending on different things you're doing, you have the choice of either. But before we make that final decision, let's look at some of the other types of fonts as well. So next we have script. So these are those really flowy, they all join together kind of fonts. So these ones you're not going to be using for body copy, obviously. These are going to be more for headers. And you want to also be sure when it comes to branding that you pick fonts that are readable. So this is something that you're not going to want to be using too crazy amount, but you may want it for different headlines and that. So if you can find a script that's a quite easy to read, nice script, it could be a good brand. Next are calligraphy fonts. Now these can be a little bit less readable. They can be absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, but you've got to be sure that you're using it for the right reason. So if you're trying to create a very delicate and romantic feel, like maybe you're a wedding photographer, a calligraphy font may work very well for you. But you want to be careful not to overuse it too, and choosing one that is still fairly easy to read. Next, we've got handwritten fonts. Now again, this is one of those ones that you don't want to be overusing too much, but it can add a lot of personality and character to your branding if you want something that feels a little bit more handmade. And then finally, decorative fonts. Now there are other kinds of fonts like slab serifs and all that, but just sort of bulk them in the serif ones for now. Decorative fonts tend to be more things that you just use as like one-off stuff, like a poster. You know, it's sort of things where you might get a real grungy or gothic, a font that's very detailed and got a really distinct feeling to it. So it's not really one that you'd use as your main branding font, but more of kind of font that you may want to use for special occasions, like when you're advertising a special event or a special product or using within a logo. Now, when it comes to selecting your fonts, there's the rule of 3. So you don't want any more than 3 fonts, because to really get that consistency up, you want to be keeping the number of fonts you're using quite low. Now you've got to really think about how you're going to be using these. Deciding to only have one brand font is possible, but you've got to be sure that it's going to work with all the different uses. Usually 2 to 3 is the ideal when it comes to branding. So when it comes to considering what kind of fonts you might be needing, you've got to really start listing out all the different uses. So think you're going to need body text, you're going to need headers, maybe you're going to need ones for special headers or page titles or for events. Think about how you're going to be using your fonts and test them out. See how they're going to work within what you're using them for and what you're going to be needing. You want to be sure that you're creating this sort of brand package where you've got all the things that you need. So when it comes to creating a graphic, you're not going, I don't really have a font that's going to suit what I'm doing. You want to be sure that there's always all these elements you can choose from that are going to make it easy to do the job. And if 2 to 3 fonts feels limiting to you, remember you can change things up in other ways. Things like spacing and color and bold and italic, size, uppercase, lowercase. There's all these other treatments that you can give to your typography so that you can make things more interesting. So while you may only be using 2 fonts, there's all these other ways that you can make them interesting and different. All right, so font pairing. So once you've decided, okay, maybe you decide you need 2 fonts and you really would like one serif and one sans serif. You're just going to go with those. Now, how do you actually pair 2 fonts together? How do you find 2 fonts that are going to work well together? Now, when it comes to font pairing, you really got to think the main things you're going to be pairing together would be body text and headers. So that's what we're looking for, is 2 fonts where one is the header and one's the body copy, and making sure that they look really good together. What I would recommend is starting with 1 font. So finding one of them that you really feel is ideal for your branding and is really communicating what you want with your brand. And then you start going to look for a font that goes well. So I've got some great websites you can look at for suggestions when it comes to font pairing. We've got type.io, we've got fontpair.co, we've got FontJoy, we've got the ultimate list of Google font pairings if you decide that you'd like to use some Google fonts, and we've also got Canva's font pairing guide. So I'll make sure to link these resources in the description below if you want to check them out, and they'll really help you to start working out how you can start pairing some fonts together. Now, what are you actually saying with your fonts? When it comes to selecting those fonts, you need to really consider what you're communicating about your brand in that font selection. So back to that wedding photographer example, you want something that feels elegant and romantic and soft. So you're not going to choose a font that's really bold and big and strong, are you? You really want to be matching the font with the feeling of your brand's identity, and also being sure that it appeals to your target audience and also positions your brand the way you want. So if you're trying to make a brand that feels very high class and position it as a premium brand, you're going to want a font that really reflects that, something that feels a bit more traditional or formal. You're not going to be wanting to choose a font that feels really cheap and cheerful. A simple way to do this is just write out a few keywords about the feeling you want to create with your brand, and then also the positioning. So do you want it to look like a premium brand, or do you want it to be more high street average, or do you want it to look like a cheaper discount brand? And then who is that target audience? Who are you trying to appeal to? Are you trying to appeal to children or to fashionistas or to bloggers? Really think about who that person is, the kind of feeling you want to create, and the positioning you want for your branding. Once you work out those 3 things and write out a few keywords, it's going to be a lot easier to try and look for fonts that you feel really encapsulate those feelings. Next, be sure to test your fonts. So even if you think you've found these perfect fonts that really communicate your brand well, that, you know, pairing up really nicely and looking good, it's really important to test them out and make sure they really are going to work for what you're doing. So try them out in various things that you'd normally do when it comes to your brand. Things like trying them out on your website. Make sure they look good on web. Even make sure that they look good on the phone. When it comes to having your website small on a phone screen, how does it look when printed out on a poster? How does it look on a blog post? How does it look on a graphic? How does it look when it comes to making like a quote graphic or anything that you normally do? Try those fonts out. Make sure that they're working well for that, and make sure you're not having that itch where you're like, I feel like I need something else here. Something's not quite right here. Is it that you need a 3rd font? Maybe they're not working quite so well together once you put them in situ, and maybe you just want to use the 1 font, and maybe just using things like bolding and spacing and color and italics and things like that to differentiate. So do some playing around, do some experiments, and make sure that they're really working for you. I hope you found that useful, and don't forget, if you want to learn more about branding, graphic design and creativity, then be sure to subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you next time.